You ever said something that got so misunderstood it caused a huge headache? It's like an old couple that goes out to eat once a month as part of their date night. They do it religiously. It's just part of their schedule. And one day, the husband looks at the wife and says, "Let's go out." Now, when they've gone out in the past, this has always meant that they got dressed up, they went to the same nice restaurant, and, that was their thing. Well, when the husband said it this time, he was thinking more like, "Hey, let's go get some burgers," because it wasn't the regularly scheduled time to go out to eat. The wife heard it and thought, "Oh, we get to go out twice this month." And so she goes, she gets dressed, and she does her hair, she puts on the makeup, she's looking really nice, she puts on her outfit to go out to eat. She comes downstairs, and the husband's still in the same jeans and a t-shirt that he was, and they kind of look at each other like, "Huh?" That's what happened to Paul in Thessalonica. The reason we have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is because Paul said, "Let's go out to eat," and the Thessalonian church thought it meant one thing, and really he meant something else. And so we are starting our study of the Thessalonian letters to understand how Paul made an error, if you can call it that. It might not have been an error, it just might have been a misunderstanding, and how he went about fixing that. And the error that he's talking about is something that we all tend to really get into. It's about the end of the world. So this study, if you're curious about the way end times work, or how we're supposed to live our lives with the knowledge that Jesus is coming back, you might want to stick around. This might be a study worth pouring into. So let's get into this. Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute. This is a weekly video where I talk about Jesus, Christianity, and for the last several weeks, months even, we've been doing Bible study. So we're going to keep on with that because it's worked out really well. So this is our new season of the Bible study section. We are going to be in the Thessalonian letters. So anytime you study anything in the Bible, really anything in general, if you're reading something, you need to understand three things. You need to understand who wrote it, who they were writing to, and why they were writing. Now, especially with something that's like 2,000 years old, the way the Thessalonian letters are, you can never truly understand that last part because there's just too big a gap between your worldview, your understanding of things, your knowledge and understanding of the way things work and science and all that. There's just too big a gap. The way ancient peoples thought on the other side of the world 2,000 years ago is drastically different than the way you and I do. So you can never truly understand that, but we have to make the attempt to try as best we can to put ourselves in their shoes. So we're going to go through that this week. This is just going to be the introduction, the context, answering those three questions. Who wrote it, who was he writing to, and why was he writing? We've already kind of touched on those three things a little bit, but let's look at them with a little bit more depth so that as we study this, we can reference this. You can go back and say, "Oh yeah, I know this is Paul saying this because of this, and this means that in that context because we looked at this." All right, so that's why we're doing this. We need to make sure we understand those three questions before we really study the content of the Thessalonian letters. So, who wrote it? Paul. Right? This is a Pauline letter, and Pauline just meaning it was a letter that Paul wrote. And so a lot of times when you study these and you look at like in the study section of your Bibles, the intro and the background, they'll be like, "Well, this letter's authorship is disputed, blah, blah, blah." First Thessalonians, they don't say that. The First Thessalonian letter, it's undisputed. Like even the people that will nitpick everything about the authorship of different letters, they don't dispute First Thessalonians as Pauline, as written by Paul. It is undisputed. Nobody really disputes that. Second Thessalonians, a little bit differently. And so there's four big reasons that people will point to and say, they don't think Paul wrote this letter. And they kind of fall apart pretty quickly if you remember the context of when they were written. And that just to skip ahead a little bit in this lesson, the context is Paul was writing within a few months at the most of the first letter to fix a misunderstanding, right? So he's writing to correct an issue that was caused by something he wrote in the first letter. You'll see what I mean by that in here in a second. So the first one is eschatology. Eschatology is a church word that means study of end times. It's not specifically a church word. You can use it in other contexts, but it's used a lot in the church. And and it's really only used in deep Bible studies. It really just means the study of the end times. And so one of the things they point to is they say in the first letter, Paul has a tone where he talks about Jesus' return as being imminent, a thief in the night. It's Jesus is coming back right now. And in the second letter, he talks more about like all these things have to happen before Jesus comes back. And they say his eschatology changes, his understanding of what has to happen before the end changes. And that's not true at all. What they gel together perfectly. Think of the second letter as Paul going into more detail about what has to happen before Jesus comes back, but it could happen imminently. It could happen quickly. Paul he's fixing the issue of people hearing the message that Jesus could come back at any moment and just he's saying, all right, well, we're just going to wait. Like, why would I go to work if Jesus is coming back right now? Why would I get married? Why would I live my life? I don't need to live my life. Jesus is coming back. Like, that was the misunderstanding. And so if you're fixing that misunderstanding, you got to go into more detail about what you meant when you were just speaking in broad terms in the first letter. So his eschatology didn't change. I mean, 2 Thessalonians, the eschatology in it is the same one you see in John and Revelation and the other places that it's talked about. It gels perfectly, or else the church fathers who put the list of what's in the New Testament, they wouldn't have kept it, right? So it gels with the rest of the New Testament in the Bible. It gels with 1 Thessalonians. It's a really weak argument to say that changed when it really didn't. All right? So first one, eschatology, study the end times. Second thing, literary features. Now, literary features are just like the qualities of the writing. And you would think that it'd be like, oh, they're too different. That's what they're pointing to. But no, this argument is they're too similar. See, a really common practice in the ancient world was to write things as if you are somebody famous so that people will read your writings. They call it pseudepigrapha. It's not important that you remember that word, but it's a really common thing. And so when people would create these pseudepigraphal writings, they would try to copy the style and the tone and the literary features of that. And this argument is they're too similar. The person copied it too closely. No author would really stick with the same pattern that closely, which if Paul's writing within a few weeks to a few months of himself, why wouldn't he? Like, it's a really weak argument to say that the same author writing two letters sounding too similar means that one was a fake. It's I don't buy it, but that's one of the arguments, all right? So, eschatology, study end times, literary features, they're too similar. The third one is the exact opposite of number two, authorial tone, they're too different. Paul's tone in the first one is very gentle and warm, and he's showing love and encouraging. The second one, he's harsher, even though I don't really think he's harsh because he does a lot of blessings and stuff like that in it. But regardless, the thought is that Paul didn't write the second one because the tone's harsher. But again, if you remember that Paul is simply writing the second letter to fix a misunderstanding from what he wrote in the first letter, well, yeah, the tone's going to be different. He's writing to fix a problem. He's writing to address an issue, not just writing a general letter. So, yeah, that, again, really weak argument. So one says they're too similar. One says they're too different. The tone changes too much. These aren't very good arguments, but there are what out there, and it's important that you understand them when you study these. And the last one is Paul's signature, his mark of authenticity. This is something that was new to me when I was studying this, because I didn't know, I didn't know this, that Paul actually signed several of his letters. He signed 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Colossians, and Philemon. We don't have that signature because we don't have the original letters anymore, but he says, and he talks about in those letters that he signed them. He may have signed the other ones too, we just don't have the original copy, and he didn't mention his signature, but he makes a point to mention it here. And so the argument is that because Paul didn't sign every single one of his letters, this is a forgery or somebody trying to convince you, again, getting back to the pseudepigrapha thing, that this really is Paul because he really did sign it. Again, we don't know if Paul signed the other letters or not because we don't have the original letters, and he doesn't mention his signature in those, but he mentions it in these other ones. So Paul did sign his letters for sure, some of them. It's not a good argument. All right, so those are the four arguments why Paul might not have written 2 Thessalonians. The study, his end times changed. It's too similar to the first one. It's too different from the second one. And Paul signed this one, but didn't sign every letter. The whole point is, I think Paul wrote it, right? I think Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. It makes sense. All those arguments there's some merit to them, but if you put them in the context of when and how Paul was writing, they fall apart pretty quick. So there's your author. There's not really Paul wrote them. Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, right? That's big important. Study the book of Acts and the rest of Paul's letters, and you can understand his perspective. You can spend your whole life studying Paul. So it's just, there you go. Paul wrote it. That's the context of the author. We're going to look at when he was writing and where he was writing from at the end of today's lesson, so stick around for that. The second part is, who was he writing to? Now, if you were around for our study in the Ephesian letters, this was a trick question. Who was the Ephesian letter written to? It wasn't written to the Ephesian church. It was written to the churches in the area surrounding Ephesians, and Ephesus was the major city in that region, and so it probably went there first and was distributed from there, but it was designed as a circular, right? The Ephesian letter wasn't written to the Ephesians. Thessalonians, it's not a trick question. It was written to the church in the city of Thessalonica, modern Thessaloniki. So let's look at the context of that city. It is located in southern Macedonia, which, if you're unfamiliar with your history, Macedonia's favorite son is Alexander the Great. If you don't know him, he's the reason that you can look all over the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, find a bunch of cities named Alexandria. The guy never lost a battle. He conquered everything that he set his eyes upon. The guy he's one of the greatest military leaders of all time, but more than his military conquest, he was an exponent of Greek culture, even though Macedonia isn't actually in Greece. It's in northern Greece, but it's also part of Bulgaria and the Balkan area. But culturally, they were Greek, but politically and the way they operated, they were not Greek. But anyways, that's kind of beside the point, because Alexander the Great was several hundred years before Paul's time. But his impact on it carried on to the day, even down to the language. Paul wrote in Greek because of Alexander the Great, right? So Macedonia is the home of Alexander the Great. The city itself was named after Alexander's half-sister, a guy named Cassander, which was one of Alexander's generals, conquered the city, rebuilt it, and he named it after his wife, who was Alexander's half-sister, Thessalonica. I can't pronounce it, and I'm not going to put it on the screen because it's irrelevant. But it's named after Alexander the Great's half-sister, and it was really set up in 315 BC in the context that it was in Paul's day. And before that, there was a city there called Thermae, which means hot springs, because there's hot springs there. But then in Rome, in 164 BC, Rome conquered it, and they made it the capital of the province, think state, of Macedonia. This was a region that they had conquered, they set up, and it became a senatorial province, which is significant because it means that it was loyal to Rome enough, or that Rome felt it was loyal enough that they didn't need to station troops there. The province was under the Senate's control. They had representatives, etc., etc. It was a very Rome-loyal territory, and Macedonia was Thessalonica was the capital of it. And then if you fast forward a little bit to the Second Roman Civil War, where Mark Antony and Cleopatra fought against Octavian, who eventually became known as Augustus Caesar. Thessalonica remained loyal to Augustus, and so he rewarded that loyalty when he won by making them a free city, which goes beyond just the senatorial province privileges. It meant that no Roman soldiers could ever be quartered there, and that the city could govern itself. They were able to elect their own leaders in an assembly, and that assembly is what governed the city. And so when you see things like the city leaders, they would rise up and kick the Christians out of town, kick Paul out of town. That's who these people were. These were the elected officials that they only existed because they supported Augustus Caesar during his civil war. Okay, that's just context to help you understand a little bit more when we see these interactions with city leaders. That's who they were, and they're only there because of this history. As far as the city itself, where it's located, it was hugely significant for two reasons. The first one was it had a really good harbor. It was kind of the main harbor for this side of the sea. The other side, it was Ephesus. The other side was Troas in Ephesus. This was the main shipping harbor for this northeastern Greece area. And so it was a boom town. It was very economically successful because of the harbor alone. But then it also was a main stopping point on the Via Egnatia, Egnata, Ignatia, the Ignatian Way. And you might be like, what does the road have to do with it? I mean, honestly, it's the same as in our day. If there's an interstate running through a town, especially if it has a port, that town's probably going to grow because it makes sense to do business there. That's exactly the way Thessalonica was. Think of Thessalonica kind of like a New York City or a Los Angeles, it had the roads, it had the ports, it had everything it needed to be economically successful. It was the political capital of the region. It was hugely influential. And on top of that, the Ignatian Way, it's the road that connected Europe to Constantinople, right? Rome, if you were shipping something from Rome and you're going over land, the quickest way to do that was the Via Egnatia. And if you are familiar with the Silk Road, it ended in Constantinople or modern-day Istanbul or Byzantium, depending on your time in history. But that city is the connecting between Europe and Asia, all the way to China. It all goes through right there. And so if you're shipping silk or whatever from the Middle East or from the Far East or from India, and you're taking it to Europe, more than likely it's going to go right through Thessalonica. And so the whole world is going to this city. Now that's a big deal because if you're going to spread a religion, you need to set up shop in a city like this, right? It needs to take root here so that it can be carried to the rest of the world. And so as we read in the book of Acts of the context of Paul coming to Thessalonica, why maybe God intentionally pushed Paul in that direction, right? So that's pretty much it. The Thessalonian church, it was a successful church. It was not a successful, it was a successful city with a big population, a booming government, a booming economy that was influential, was connected to the whole world. And the only other thing I want to say on the city is the three people groups we really look at in the Bible that have influence are Romans, Greeks, and Jews. Paul preaches in the synagogue. Now, a synagogue is not like a modern-day church in a sense. You know, a modern-day church is really centered around Sunday morning. Some of them have outreach, they're used for other things. But a synagogue was primarily a Jewish community center rather than just a place for worship. Like, they did have worship there. They did study the Bible there. They did have school. They have classes there. But it was a Jewish community center was what they were designed to be. It was really just one big open rectangular or square room. In order for one of those to be there had to be one of two things. There had to either be a large Jewish population that could fund it, or there had to be a wealthy backer. So if you look at the synagogue in Capernaum, that was funded by a Roman centurion. That was the way that they were able to build it. And so the fact that there's a synagogue in Thessalonica means there was a large Jewish population there. Why does that matter? Well, it affects Paul's strategy when he reaches a city. Because Jewish people understood the context of Jesus. Like, they understood what a Messiah was, what a Christ was. They understood why he had to come. They understood the foundation of the Old Testament. Paul wouldn't have to explain that when he started preaching about Jesus if he went to Jewish people first. And so if there was a large Jewish population, he would go to their synagogue and he would preach on the Saturdays, their Sabbath day, and he would explain who Jesus was. And so that matters, right? That it influences where Paul started from. Because if he goes to a city that doesn't have a large Jewish population, he has to explain the context of Jesus before he explains Jesus. Does that make sense? So Paul, in this city, Paul started with the Jewish population, then he expanded from there. So we're going to look at that here in a second. So that's the context. Who did Paul write to? He wrote to the Thessalonian church, the Christians that were in Thessalonica. Who was writing? Paul, right? So let's look at the purpose. And for this, we're going to look at the study. This is what makes these letters so unique is we know exactly when and where and why Paul was writing. Like a lot of Paul's letters, we kind of have to guess on a lot of those things. We have to guess when did he write, why was he writing, what were the issues. Like we have to read them and look at the context and figure that out for ourselves. These letters, we don't have that. We know exactly when he wrote. In Acts chapters 16 and 17, we get the story of Paul's dealings with his church and why he would have written to it. All right? So it's unique that we get to see the whole context. The other thing is these are the earliest letters we have of Paul. Like the other letters, most of Paul's letters we have come from a lot later in life. It's wisdom from age and experience. These are from when Paul was getting that experience and learning those wisdom. Like this letter is written as Paul, going for it. This is Paul in the midst of being that person that we talk about, talking about his missionary journey. So these letters were written during his second missionary journey. And so it's unique. It's a different flavor from the pastoral epistles or the prison epistles being letters. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to read from 3 sections of the story of Paul's dealing with Thessalonica. The first one is why Paul even went that direction. So in Acts chapter 16, starting verse 6, he says, "And they," Paul and his missionary buddies, "they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, and having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia," Asia being the province of Asia, not the region. So the province of Asia is modern-day Turkey, basically, Anatolia. So when he says Asia, that's what he means. It's that region, not China, okay? Having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia, and when they had come to Mysia, a region in there, they attempted to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So they passed by Mysia and then went down to Troas, which was that big shipping port. If you're going to leave that area, you either left through Ephesus or Troas. So they went to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So Paul had this vision, this dream of a Macedonian man. I'm assuming Paul could identify what somebody from Macedonia would look like. Maybe there was racial features or the way they dressed. I don't know, but it was clear to him this was a Macedonian person saying, "Come help us." He has this dream. And I love that Paul doesn't say, "God told me we have to go to Macedonia." Like, that's not what it says. It says that they concluded that God had called them that direction. I love that because that's more realistic. Like, we like to think of the apostles and the disciples as like anytime they felt like God called them somewhere or God did call them to somewhere, that it was crystal clear and like God handed them a piece of paper that said, "You are called to go here. Please be there by 9 a.m. Like, that's not the way it worked. Like, they had to figure it out. They had to understand. They had to study it and think about it and weigh out, is this really what God's calling me or is it not what God's calling me to do? Like, they had to do the same thing we have to do. We have to decide, okay, is this really God's call for me, or did I just, eat too much hot sauce before I went to bed? Is it just a weird dream, or is this God calling me? Like, I love that. Like, that these disciples, these people who saw Jesus face to face, even they still had to weigh out whether or not God is calling them to do something. That's not really relevant to the message of Thessalonians, but it's very encouraging, right? Because it's rare that we ever get anything that's crystal clear, black and white. God says, do this, all right? So he has this dream, and so clearly God it's called them to go to Macedonia, right? So again, it would make sense if you remember that Thessalonica and the region is kind of like New York City or LA. Like, the whole world goes through there. Well, yeah, you're going to reach both Europe and Asia if you reach this area. So it continues on. Now when they had passed through, so they leave, back up a little bit. They leave Troas. They sail over to Macedonia, this northern region of Greece. They go there, and now when they passed through a city called Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." All right, I'm going to hit the pause button right there. So Paul gets into town. He sees that there's a large Jewish population. He sees that they have a synagogue, and he goes and he starts reasoning with them. Now, if you tried to go into a church and take over the pulpit, it probably isn't going to happen unless it's like a really informal kind of church. The way synagogue services worked, it was a lot more like that. Like, if you were somebody who was learned, or you had a reputation of being a smart person, or you were a rabbi, they would offer you the mic, basically. They would say, "All right, you talk." Like, they took turns. It was a lot more of open discussion stuff rather than one guy standing up at the mic and teaching you, okay? So it's not Paul didn't walk in and just be like, "Give me the microphone, let me tell you about Jesus." Like, no, like, this was culturally acceptable, right? And so he comes in and he starts explaining, the Old Testament scriptures because the New Testament didn't exist yet. And he explains how they were talking about Jesus and how what Jesus did applies to him and how he really is the Messiah and how he really did have to suffer. And he had to change their understanding of what the Messiah was using the context that they already had, right? So Paul comes into Paul comes into the synagogue and he explains it. And it continues on. He says, and some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men from the rabble, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, who was Paul's cousin, who Paul was staying with, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find him, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, brothers being Christians, and shouting, these men have turned the world upside down and have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And the people in the city authorities, those ecclesia, the elected free governors, were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money and security from Jason, paid his bail basically, and the rest they let them go. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. So before Paul gets to Thessalonica, he goes to Philippi. And there's a really famous story that happens there with a jailer and some singing and chains getting loosed and saving a dude from killing himself. He preaches, he's successful, right? That is the first place he goes in Europe, in Macedonia. He goes to Philippi, he's successful, he causes an uproar, he leaves. He has to leave. He goes to Thessalonica. He preaches in the synagogue. He wins some Jewish believers there. They start preaching to the Greeks. Now, the time that he was in Thessalonica, it's sometimes taught that he was only there 3 weeks because it says he preached on 3 Sabbath days. But the fact that he had won some Greeks over who definitely were not in the Sabbath when he was preaching, or not in the Sabbath, in the synagogue when he was preaching, and he won some leading pagan women of the city over, this means that Paul spoke in other places too. And so he was there for sure 3 weeks, but more than likely he was there a little bit longer than that because otherwise he wouldn't have had time to win over these non-Jewish peoples. He started with the Jewish people of the city, but then he expanded from there. They provided the foundation because they understood the context, and those believers could explain the context as well as his preaching. And, that's how you multiply, right? So I don't think he was just there 3 weeks. I think he was there a little bit longer than that, anywhere from, a month or so all the way up to maybe like 9 months. I think he was there for a little while longer than it's sometimes taught. But he goes to Thessalonica. He wins some converts. He's successful. Gets brought before, causes a riot, and has to leave. He gets run out of town. Then he goes to Berea, and he goes to the synagogue, and he preaches, and he wins some converts, and then he goes to the Greeks, and he wins some converts there. And actually in Berea, he was really successful. In Acts 17, it says, now the Jews in Berea were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and they received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So Paul says, hey, these are the scriptures, these Old Testament writings, these are about Jesus, and this is how. And so those people were like, really? And they started studying it for themselves. It's the craziest thing that they didn't just be like, okay, cool, we believe you. No, they dug into it. As a minister, as a preacher, that's the most exciting thing for me, is if I teach something and somebody goes, hold on. And they go and they study it and they check it out and oh, you might be right. The fact that even if I'm wrong, you studied the script, that had to make Paul excited. Because that just shows hey, you actually care about this stuff. It's not just yeah, I guess I'm a Christian, or yeah, I guess I'm Jewish. No, they actually cared. That's exciting. So Paul says that's what they did. And so many of them believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. And then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained in Berea. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. All right? And so let me fill in some gaps from there. All right? Paul leaves. He goes by boat. He gets shipped down to Athens. He calls for Timothy and Silas, and he's curious about these churches. Paul, again, he concluded God has called him to go to Macedonia. And it seems like his call's been confirmed because he's had success immediately as soon as he goes there. But he's also had to leave these cities immediately, like really, really quickly. He does not have time to set up churches, to set up structure, to teach, to make sure people really understand, how to be a Christian, all that kind of stuff. That's part of the reason why he wrote so many letters. But he was curious, like, are these churches surviving? Are they keeping true to what I taught them? And so he sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to get a report. Timothy brings back a report. Paul writes a letter at this point from the city of Corinth, where he now is. He writes a letter to address those issues and to explain things a little bit better. Timothy, more than likely, goes back with the letter, comes back again, bringing another report saying they misunderstood it. They heard that in Paul's first letter that he said that Jesus could return imminently at any time. And so they stopped working. They said, we're just going to chill. Like, Jesus come back, I ain't fooling with none of that. Why would I go to work? I hate that job. Anyways, I'm just going to chill. They took the understanding, the idea that Jesus can come back at any time the wrong way. Because we're called to live our lives working. We're called to live our lives as if Jesus isn't going to come back in our lifetime, even if he is, because we're supposed to be out there ministering to the people that we come in contact with. We're supposed to be sharing the story of Jesus. We're supposed to be out there being responsible and respectful and building up Jesus' reputation in the world around us. And if you just sit around and do nothing, Jesus is going to get the reputation that his people sit around and do nothing. When the reality is we're supposed to earn our way. We're supposed to provide. We're supposed to improve. We're supposed to be excellent in all aspects of our life. We're supposed to hit God's standards for our lives in every way. Even though we're going to fail, and then grace, covers that. But we're supposed to be trying to. And these Thessalonians, they misunderstood it in a bad way. So Paul writes a second letter to explain it a little better. It's not that he said anything wrong in the first letter, but people took it the wrong way. And so he explained, no, yes, Jesus can come back at any time, but there's going to be several things that has to happen. So you need to be living your life as if he's not, in light of the fact that he is, right? And so we're going to look at exactly how Paul spells that out, how he explains it, how the mistake and misunderstanding came to be as we study these letters. But that is the context of the Thessalonian letters. So if you've ever been misunderstood or misunderstood somebody, I feel like these letters are going to be helpful, help you empathize a little bit with Paul and his situation here. Or if you're curious about what's going to happen in the end of the world. There's a lot of people talking about that, a lot of people curious about it. And more importantly, how you should live your life in light of it. Because it's real easy to get it wrong, just like the Thessalonians did. Not necessarily that you're going to do nothing, but there's a wrong way and a right way to live our lives in light of and preparing for Jesus' second coming. So I hope this is curious to you. I hope this piques your interest, and you'll join us as we study these Thessalonian letters. Until next week.